Okay, I think it's finally stopped tipping it down. So, hello, happy April. This is a part of the year where the months really start racing and it freaks me out every time. So, we're going to pause things and we're going to look backwards and I'm going to tell you about the 10 books I read this March. Let's start with the children's books, because last month was middle grade March after all. The first middle grade I read in March was Pax by Sara Pennypacker. This follows a boy named Peter and a fox named Pax. And Peter and Pax have been an inseparable little duo ever since Peter rescued Pax as an orphaned cub. And the story starts when Peter and Pax are separated because war is coming and Peter's dad wants him out of the way and somewhere safe. So he sends him to live with his grandfather and says the fox cannot come with him. But Peter can't stand the idea of being away from Pax, especially when he realises that his fox is going to be in danger where they left him. So he sets out to cover the 300 miles, head back to where they left Pax and see if he can find him. We alternate between Peter and Pax's points of view, and the chapters through Pax's eyes were really sweet and interesting, the way she'd written how a fox would see the world and how he's processing the fact that Peter's gone and all these new things he's observing in the world that don't make sense to a fox. I thought this was going to be more of a journey story. I thought we were going to follow Peter covering this distance on his own, but something happens quite near the start of his journey that means that's not possible, and so it's more staying in several places for longer. So I think because of that the pacing wasn't quite what I expected. I thought it would be sort of constant moving from place to place, and it's not that. But the place Peter ends up for quite a lot of this book was good in a surprising way. I did enjoy it, I just wasn't prepared. It wasn't the story I thought it was going to be. I did also struggle slightly with the fact that this isn't set in any specific place or time. The war that drives everything in this book isn't a particular war from history, and that's done on purpose. I had a look and the author's done this on purpose so it doesn't distance anyone because it's not a war that they know about, but it meant I struggled to place the book. I would have liked the context of knowing when and where this was set, but I guess that's a personal preference thing. So overall it wasn't my favourite middle grade, but I always love a child-animal duo and it was very sweet. Sort of upper middling for this one. I did enjoy reading it. It's nicely written. There were just a couple of things that didn't suit what I like in this kind of middle grade. The next two books are the result of me on several different evenings not being able to decide what to read and my boyfriend just pulling off the shelf several books that he liked as a child and saying, those will take you about 2 hours, read them. The first of these two is The Hardy Boys' Casefiles, Power Play. This is the 50th book in the Hardy Boys series. I've never read any of these books before, but I think it's sort of the same setup every time, so you can just jump in. I picked it up pretty quickly. We follow Frank and Joe, who are a pair of teenage brothers who go around solving crimes that teenagers have absolutely no right investigating, but it's the 80s and they can do what they want. In this instalment, the boys are investigating suspected industrial espionage at a tech company working on this super new solar cell that's gonna provide loads of power for the future because 80s technology. I mainly enjoyed this one because it is so 80s. As a mystery story, it's quite straightforward, very fast paced, lots of things happen very suddenly, but it's fun for all the 80s references, all the different vehicles and the tech, and the fact that one of the characters walks around with their prized possession, which is a portable CD player. So if you want some retro goodness and a book that takes about an hour and a half to read, there you go. The second was Cool by Michael Morpurgo. This follows a boy who has been in a car accident. He chased his dog out into the street when it ran off. They both got hit by a car. He is now in a coma. He can hear everything that's going on, but he can't move and he can't speak. And so for the whole book, we're following him as he's trying to figure out what's going on. He's hearing his family and his friends come into the hospital room, and it's following him as he is trying to wake up from his coma. As a writer, it was really interesting because we rely so often very heavily on description and visual things. The first way you go to describe a new place is what the characters can see. And this book can't do that because Robbie, the main character, is in a coma. He can't see anything. So for all that it's a fun little kids book, it was actually really interesting to read how a writer approaches a book where sight just can't play into it. If anyone has any recommendations for books bigger than this, with blind or partially sighted main characters, I would really love to read that, because one, I think it's something we should have more of in books, and it's something I now want to read more. And the last middle grade I read this March was The Hatmakers by Tamsin Merchant. This is set in a sort of alternative historical London where there are several families who each specialise in making a different item of clothing. They are the makers, and they include the hat makers, the glove makers, the cloak makers. They all specialise and they all hate each other, and they have done for the last few decades. There's a big rivalry going on, and we follow Cordelia Hatmaker, who was the youngest member of the Hatmaker family, and at the start of the story she is told that her father has drowned in an accident at sea. His ship has been sunk and he is presumed dead. And this is at a time when England and France are in a really strained relationship. They're heading towards peace talks and everyone is hoping that war can be avoided, but this is the big threat looming over most of the story. The hat makers are asked to make a peace hat for the princess, who is going to be taking on these peace talks because her father, the king, has a bout of silliness and can't be trusted with it. But then things start to go wrong, and it's not just the hat makers that are being affected, and Cordelia and her best friend, who is a bootmaker who she's not supposed to talk to, and another child she meets on her wanderings, get involved in this whole mystery of who is trying to mess up the peace clothes and who is sabotaging the efforts to avoid war, all while Cordelia is trying to find out what's happened to her father because she does not believe that he drowned. This was very cute, very whimsical. I liked the premise of the world, if not always the execution. I love the idea of the makers, but I thought sometimes, I didn't explain before, the clothes they make have sort of magical properties. They can put certain ingredients on, in this case, their hats, and they will have an effect on the people who wear them. They can make hats that make you confident or sensible or wise. But the things they describe, I couldn't help imagining these hats, and they would look absolutely ridiculous. They're making hats and putting whole huge flowers and ribbons made of philosopher's beard hair, and I think I'd have liked that as a child. Maybe. But I just couldn't help thinking of people wearing these hats and thinking how ridiculous they'd have looked. So maybe if there'd been a sort of subtler way that they did their hat magic, I'd have enjoyed that more. But I am not a child anymore, and it's not for me to say whether those are fun things or not. I did like Cordelia. She does what needs to be done, she goes after things, she says what she thinks, and she works everything out. So if you are looking for a whimsical, magical middle grade with a really novel world building approach and a strong, confident girl main character, give this one a go. And that was as far as I got before my camera gave up on me. And then it was Easter, and then I was very busy eating mini eggs and being in the garden in the sunshine. And so finally I'm back to fill you in on the rest of the books I got through in March. I also realised that past me miscounted her middle grade reads for the month because I forgot that I read the first book in a series of unfortunate events, The Bad Beginning. Now this is one of those kids' books I really feel like I should have read. I think maybe I wasn't into dark stories back then. And then I came across it the other day and I was like, surely I have to have read this, and why not read it in middle grade March? So I have finally started this series. And this one was very interesting, having not read it when I was the right age for it, coming to it as an adult and a writer and someone who's read quite a lot of recent middle grade. It's a lot simpler than I was expecting. The plot and the way the characters speak. I also didn't love the way the narrator comes in to tell you what words mean. When it first came in I was like, oh that's cute, that's quite a quirky way of introducing these more complicated words. But when it came up several times in a chapter, I'd kind of had enough of that a few chapters in. But those things aside, it is a really fun story. It's your classic kids overcoming their circumstances and bad grown-ups, and I don't think you can go too far wrong with that. And I also appreciate this book because at the time it was so different to any other kids book. I think it was so groundbreaking in that it was this purposefully bleak story where things kept going wrong for these poor kids. And if you look at the middle grade books that were around when I was that sort of age and the books now, there's much bigger variety in the topics and the issues they tackle, and these dark books and quirky books and sort of dark humour for kids. And I think this book kind of paved the way for that and stopped us thinking that kids need nice, safe, happy stories that always tie up neatly and end well. And for that, it was an incredibly important book, and I'm glad I've now read it. And now that really is me done with middle grade for the month. And next I read Embroideries by Marjane Satrapi. This is a fascinating little graphic novel. This is a book about the author's conversation with lots of different members of her family about their sex lives, which seems a weird topic for a graphic novel, but I thought it worked really well. Let me show you. It's this very bold art style, which I really liked, and there's not a big story to it. There are lots of little stories within it because each of the women in this family take turns talking about their experiences with sex and relationship and how that relates to their culture. This family are all Iranian, and the different generations have dealt with these completely different attitudes to their role in a relationship and the expectations on them as women. This was a really fun and really enlightening look into a culture that I haven't read much about, and the way these different generations view themselves and their roles in the world and how they relate to each other. I'm only going to talk briefly about this next one because if you watch book videos, you've probably seen about 8,000 reviews of it. I finally got round to reading Hamnet. I have owned this for many months, and I think possibly it scared me. I think I was worried. I'd seen all these amazing reviews and I was worried I wouldn't like it. And I finally read it and I did like it, so it's all fine. If you've somehow avoided all the chat around this follows Agnes, the wife of a very famous playwright from history who is not named in this book, and their 3 children and their extended family. And Agnes has got healer, witchy vibes. She's very different from the expectations of women at this time. She does what she wants, she wanders off when people are expecting her to be somewhere else. Their relationship is very interesting, and then we're also following Hamnet, the son, and his two sisters as something bad is going on. It's sort of hinted on the blurb, but I won't spoil it. Something bad is unfolding through this book, and it doesn't end well for all of the characters. Looking back at it, for the size of the book, not a huge amount happens, given that I normally read sort of fantasy adventure books where in that number of pages a huge amount can happen. Plot-wise, you could sum it up in a few pages, but the thing with this book is the language. It's very lyrical, very beautiful, and there's a lot about the people. And I normally don't love people-y focused books, and I think possibly not everyone will get on with the language in this one, but I enjoyed it. It was a nice change from the sort of writing I usually gravitate towards, and I think this one has made me think I can look at picking up more books like this. This next book, Notes to Self by Emilie Pine, is one that I don't think I'd heard of particularly. I just came across it in a charity shop, loved this cover design, loved the sound of the blurb, and gave it a go. This is a collection of 6 essays about different times and different areas of Emilie's life. It deals with things like her father's illness, her dealings with infertility, her wild, unbalanced teenage years, and how she's looking back on those and looking at who she is now and how all of those things tie into who she's become. Her writing style is really honest and sort of familiar. It feels like a friend has written you a really long email explaining what's going on with them at the moment, and I really enjoyed that. This is not a book to read if you don't want to think about other people having a hard time, I would say. I was going to say don't read it if you're going through a hard time, but for some people maybe it's comforting to see someone reflecting on the things they've been through and how they've moved past that. But maybe just have a look at what these essays are about if you think maybe you're not in a place to read about them. But generally this is a really lovely, reflective, thoughtful, sometimes very funny, very personal set of essays, and I am really glad I read them. It said don't read it in public because you'll cry, and I didn't, but I can see why you might. Yeah, really enjoyed this one. I don't know what happened in March, but I only listened to one audiobook, and that was Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. I've been seeing quite a lot of people talk about T. Kingfisher's books on BookTube, and I thought this one sounded very much like my kind of vibes, and it really nearly was. In Nettle and Bone we follow Mara, who is the third-born princess of a tiny little kingdom, and she watches as both of her sisters, one after the other, are married off to a really awful prince from a nearby kingdom. Her oldest sister dies in mysterious circumstances, and then her second sister is married off to this same man, and Mara knows he is not treating her sisters well, and she wants to sort things out. She wants to go and deal with him. She starts out as this quiet princess living her life in a convent as a nun, away from all the court and all of the normal princessy things, and she ends up on this adventure putting together this quirky group of people who are going to help her sort this prince out. And there's magic, and there's a grave witch, and there's a dog reanimated from bones, and there's a chicken possessed by a demon, and it's this quest essentially, and there's sort of embroidery as a plot point, and it should have been a book that I loved from all of those things, and there was just something missing for me. I think the main thing I took issue with was Mara didn't do a great deal herself, it felt. She gets the gang together and that starts with her having to do some things herself, but it felt like once she had the group assembled, she sort of just followed them around while they each did useful things. It wasn't until right at the end again that she changed the plot herself. And I think maybe this is one that I'd have been better off actually reading with my eyes rather than listening, because once we got into this bit where it was just Mara following the others around, I have to admit I kind of zoned out in points, and I think I missed some fun bits. Maybe I lost sort of the momentum of the plot, but it just wasn't quite holding me, because Mara could have wandered off for sort of the middle third of the book, caught up with everyone later, and the same things would have come of that. If anyone has read this and I've missed something really important and I'm getting this completely wrong, please let me know, and maybe I need to go back to some of it. But I think vibes, perfect. Plot and execution, not quite there for me. And finally, my last book of March was Richard Osman's The Thursday Murder Club. Our main characters in this book are 4 residents of a very fancy retirement village who have set up the Thursday Murder Club, where they meet to discuss and try to solve old murder cases. And their murder solving gets a bit closer to home when someone they know, someone involved in the running of their retirement village, gets murdered. The 4 of them decide this is a case for them, because the police aren't going to do a good enough job and they need to find out if there's a killer living near them. I'd say this is very similar to the Marlowe Murder Club. You've got your lead elderly woman who is very smart and cunning and knows a lot more than you'd expect a nice old lady to know, and her group of murder-solving chums, and they become friends with a young and overlooked police woman, and they stick their noses in and solve a crime. So that was very interesting. If you like one, I suspect you'll like the other. I did enjoy this. I liked all the characters. I liked how everything came together in the end. I guessed one of the big reveals at the end, but not any of the others, so that's fun. I would say though, there were too many points of view. We've already got 4 protagonists, and then 2 police officers, and then we have chapters from the points of view of the first victim. Not to give things away, there are more than one victim. And then the suspects, and we jump across all of these different people. I think we have at least 10 points of view through this book, and then you've got chapters where Joyce, one of the murder club members, is writing in a journal, and there's not enough time to get really comfortable in any of those points of view. I think also, given that we're focusing on the Thursday Murder Club and how they're going about solving this mystery, I'm not sure we needed chapters from the points of view of the suspects. I think all the information learned in those chapters, we could have seen the members finding out themselves. I also think there was maybe a bit too much time spent on the more senior police officer, because he did play a big part in the story, but he himself wasn't very interesting. Every chapter from his point of view was him thinking about how his life wasn't going how he'd expected it to, and how he was a bit disappointed in himself. And that didn't really go anywhere. He was just always feeling like that. And I think maybe he got a bit more airtime than he needed. But those things taken into account, this was still a really fun mystery. I'm really enjoying cozy crime, old people solving mysteries at the moment, especially if they're old people that don't behave like you'd expect old people to. I loved the central four in this, and in their different ways how they each went against what you'd expect from a retired person. And that was March, a pretty good reading month, I would say. Nice variety of books, but I do need to get back on it with the audiobooks, so I might go and find something to listen to now. I'm having a quite slow April reading wise, and that's possibly because of the first book I chose to read for the month, which I will tell you about next time. But until then, enjoy the rest of April, enjoy your Easter chocolate if you have any left, and I'll be back with more books in a few weeks. Bye!